My hiking partner went to get water from the creek and came back different. I need to say that up front because if I try to build to it slowly, I might talk myself out of telling this at all. And I have been talking myself out of it for almost a year now. Every time I sit down to put this into words, some part of my brain offers a reasonable alternative. Dehydration, altitude, sleep deprivation, a small psychotic break brought on by exertion and low blood sugar. I have run through every version that lets the world stay normal, and none of them hold together when I lay out what actually happened, step by step, in the order it occurred. So here it is. The trip was Darren's idea. We had been planning it loosely for about 2 years. One of those things friends talk about over beers that never quite becomes real until someone books the flights. Darren booked the flights. 2 round trips from Atlanta to Bozeman, Montana, mid-September, right at the tail end of the season before the high passes start getting unreliable. The plan was a 5-day loop through a section of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness that Darren had been studying on maps since the previous winter. Not a technical route, no climbing gear, no glacier crossings, just high-altitude backcountry with long days, big elevation changes, and very few other people. That last part was the draw. Darren was not an antisocial person. He was the most social person I knew, actually. The kind of guy who talked to everyone in line at the grocery store, who remembered the names of bartenders 3 states away. But something about wilderness emptied him out in a way that made him better, calmer, more himself, whatever that means. He said once that the mountains were the only place where he didn't feel like he was performing. I think about that a lot now. I should describe Darren so you understand what changed. He was 31, same as me. A little shorter, 5'9" maybe, with a wide frame and the kind of durable fitness that comes from actually using your body for work, rather than just exercising. He managed a landscape architecture crew in Decatur and spent most of his days hauling flagstone and digging trenches, so he was strong in a way that had nothing to do with the gym. Brown hair, usually too long, pushed back under a cap. A gap between his front teeth that showed when he smiled, which was often. And his voice. This is important. Darren had a very specific voice. Not deep, not high. Sort of warm and a little raspy. With a rhythm to it that made everything he said sound like he was letting you in on something. You know how some people talk at you and other people talk with you? Darren was the second kind. He made you feel included in whatever he was thinking. That rhythm, that cadence, is one of the things that changed. And it was one of the first things I noticed, before I had any reason to be looking. We flew into Bozeman on a Tuesday morning and drove a rented truck south along 89 through Livingston, and then up into the mountains, along a forest road that got progressively rougher until the GPS signal dropped, and we were navigating by the laminated map Darren had printed. The trailhead was unmarked, just a wide spot in the road with a log barrier and a boot path leading into dense lodgepole pine. We were hiking by 11. The first 2 days were uneventful in the best possible way. We covered about 14 miles each day, climbing gradually through timber into open subalpine meadow, then up above tree line to a broad saddle with views in every direction that made you feel like you were standing on the spine of the earth. The weather held. Cool mornings, warm afternoons, no wind to speak of. We saw elk on the first evening, and a pair of mountain goats on the second morning, white shapes moving across a distant rock field, with a slowness that made them look prehistoric. We talked about work, about our families, about a road trip we had taken to Big Bend in college, where Darren had accidentally driven the car into a ditch, and we had spent 4 hours waiting for a rancher to pull us out with a chain. Normal stuff. Good stuff. The kind of conversation that only happens when you strip away every distraction and walk next to someone for 8 hours with nothing to do but talk and look. On the third morning, we dropped off the saddle into a long valley that ran roughly east to west. The map showed a creek at the bottom, a tributary of a larger drainage that eventually fed into the Yellowstone River, and Darren wanted to make camp near the water. We were both running low on filtered water, and the idea of a creek camp after 2 nights on dry ridgelines sounded perfect. The descent took most of the morning. The terrain was loose scree transitioning into talus, and then finally into thick brush as we got lower, the kind of tangled alder and willow that grabs at your pack straps and makes every step feel like a negotiation. By the time we reached the valley floor, it was early afternoon, and we were both scratched up and tired. The creek was bigger than I expected. Not a river, but a solid 10 feet across in most places, moving fast over smooth stones, with the kind of clarity that lets you see every pebble on the bottom. The water was cold enough to ache when I dipped my hand in. The sound of it filled the valley, a constant rushing that was louder than it seemed like it should be, a white noise that covered other sounds. On both sides, the valley walls rose steeply into the same scree fields we had descended, but the valley floor itself was flat and grassy, maybe 100 yards wide, dotted with clusters of spruce and the occasional boulder left behind by glaciers. It was beautiful. It was one of the most beautiful places I have ever been. We set up camp about 30 yards from the creek on a flat patch of grass between 2 spruce clusters. I started organizing dinner while Darren rigged the bear hang for our food bags. We were efficient at this by day 3. The routine was comfortable. I remember feeling deeply content in that moment, crouched over the stove watching water heat, listening to the creek, and watching Darren toss the rope over a branch with a smooth, practiced motion. I remember thinking this is what it is supposed to feel like. We ate early, rehydrated chili and instant mashed potatoes, and coffee that tasted better than any coffee I have ever had in a restaurant because of the cold air and the tiredness and the satisfaction of having earned it. Darren was telling me about a project his crew was starting in Buckhead, a retaining wall for a client who kept changing the stone selection, and he was doing an impression of the client that had me laughing hard enough that my ribs hurt. That gap-toothed grin, that warm rhythm in his voice, the way he could stretch a word for comic effect without it ever feeling forced. That was the last completely normal moment. I have gone over it so many times that it feels like a photograph now, something I can hold up and examine. Everything before that moment belongs to the world as I understood it. Everything after belongs to whatever the world actually is. We needed water. Our bottles were empty and the filter was still packed. I started to get up, but Darren waved me off. He grabbed both our bottles and the filter pump and said he would take care of it. The creek was 30 yards away. I could hear it clearly from where I sat. I watched him walk toward it in the fading light, his silhouette moving between the spruce trunks, and then the trees blocked my view, and I heard, faintly under the sound of the water, the clatter of him setting the bottles down on the rocks. He was gone for about 20 minutes. That is longer than it should take to pump 2 liters of water through a filter. At the time, I assumed he was washing up, maybe rinsing his shirt or soaking his feet. It was not unusual. I did not think about it. I leaned back against my pack and watched the sky change color above the ridge, deep blue going to violet, the first stars beginning to appear. The air temperature was dropping fast. I pulled on my fleece and waited. When Darren came back through the trees, he was carrying both bottles, full, one in each hand. He walked to the camp and set them down beside the stove, and sat on his sleeping pad across from me, and I noticed something immediately, though it took me a long time to articulate what it was. He sat down differently, not in a way I could point to and say that is wrong. More like the way you notice when someone has rearranged the furniture in a room you know well. Everything is still there, but the spacing is off. Darren usually sat with his legs crossed or with one knee up, leaning back on his hands. This time he sat with both legs straight out in front of him, close together, his hands resting on his thighs, his back very straight. It looked uncomfortable. It looked like someone who had been told to sit down but had not been told how. I asked him if the water was cold. He said yes, but the word came out flat. Not tired flat, not distracted flat. Flat the way a note is flat when an instrument is slightly out of tune. The word was correct, but the music of it was wrong. The rasp was gone. The warmth was gone. It sounded like Darren's voice played back through a speaker that could not quite reproduce the full range. I asked him if he was all right. He looked at me and said he was fine, and he smiled. The smile was geometrically correct. The gap between the teeth was there. The shape of the mouth was right, but it sat on his face like something placed there, rather than something that arose from the inside. I felt a pulse of wrongness that I immediately suppressed. You do not look at your best friend of 9 years sitting across from you at camp and think something is fundamentally off about him. Your brain will not let you. It files the observation away and offers you fatigue, altitude, low light, and the natural strangeness of seeing a familiar face in an unfamiliar environment. I said something about the stars coming out. He tipped his head back and looked up and said yes. Just the word. No elaboration. Darren was the kind of person who would have said something like, "Man, you forget they can look like this," or would have pointed out a constellation and gotten the name slightly wrong the way he always did. This Darren looked up, confirmed the existence of the stars, and looked back down. We went to bed shortly after. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the creek and tried to convince myself that nothing had happened. People get quiet. People get tired. 3 days of hard hiking at altitude can do strange things to your energy. I fell asleep telling myself that Darren would be normal in the morning. He was not normal in the morning. He was awake before me, which was not unusual, but he was sitting in exactly the same posture I had last seen him in, legs straight, hands on thighs, back straight, staring at the creek. Not at anything specific, just at the water. When I said good morning, he turned his head and said good morning, and the flatness was still there, and now in the full light of day I could see something else that had not been visible the night before. His eyes were wrong. Not the color, not the shape, the movement. When Darren looked at something, his eyes moved the way everyone's eyes move, in quick little jumps, scanning, adjusting, focusing. This version of Darren turned his eyes to me smoothly, like a camera on a track. One continuous motion, no micro adjustments. It settled on my face and stayed there without the tiny natural fluctuations that I had never consciously noticed until they were absent. I asked him how he slept. He said fine. I asked him if he was feeling okay. He said yes. I asked him if the altitude was getting to him. He said no. Every answer was a single word or two, delivered in that flat, reduced version of his voice, and every answer was technically responsive to the question, but carried no additional information, no personality, no Darren-ness. I decided to test something. I brought up the Buckhead client, the retaining wall, the impression he had done the night before. I said something like, "You had me dying with that impression last night." He looked at me and said, "Yeah, that was funny." But he did not smile when he said it, and the sentence had no rhythm. It was 4 words delivered at the same speed with the same emphasis, like someone reading off a card. My skin prickled. I am not someone who frightens easily. I work in logistics. I spend my days solving problems. My brain is wired to look for explanations, and I was looking hard. I thought about hypothermia, even though the temperatures had not been that extreme. I thought about some kind of seizure event, a mini-stroke, something neurological that had happened while he was at the creek. I asked him if he had fallen, if he had hit his head. He said no. I asked him if he could feel his hands and feet. He held up his hands and looked at them and said yes. The way he looked at his hands was the thing that made my stomach drop. He examined them the way you examine an unfamiliar tool, turning them over, considering them. He flexed the fingers and watched the tendons move under the skin with what I can only describe as interest, not recognition. Interest. We were supposed to spend day 3 at the creek camp and do a day hike up the eastern ridge. Instead, I told Darren I thought we should start heading back. I said I was not feeling great, blamed my stomach, and suggested we cut the trip short by a day. He said okay, just okay. No protest, no disappointment, no "are you sure?" Darren would have argued. Darren would have offered to carry my pack, would have suggested we wait a few hours and see if I felt better, would have done anything before agreeing to cut a trip short that he had been planning for 2 years. This person just said okay and began packing, and that is when I noticed the packing. Darren was an efficient packer. He had a system. Sleeping bag first, stuffed into the bottom of the pack. Then the pad, rolled and strapped to the side. Then clothes, then food, then rain gear on top for quick access. I had watched him pack this way dozens of times. Now he was putting things into the pack in no particular order, just picking up items and placing them inside, and when the sleeping bag did not fit because he had put the cook kit in first, he just pushed harder, compressing it into whatever space remained. He got everything in. The pack was closed and on his back in 5 minutes. But watching the process was like watching someone who had been described how a backpack works, but had never used one. We hiked out. The ascent back up to the saddle was brutal. 1,500 feet of elevation gain through that same tangled brush and loose rock. I stayed behind Darren on the trail. I told myself it was because I wanted to monitor him in case he was having a medical event. That was partly true. But it was also because I did not want him behind me. I did not want whatever was walking in front of me to be where I could not see it. And I need to explain what I mean by whatever was walking in front of me, because I know how that sounds. I am not saying that the person hiking ahead of me was not physically Darren. It was his body, his clothes, his pack, his boots, his gait pattern, his height and weight, and the shape of his shoulders. If you had shown me a photograph, I would have identified him instantly. But there is a difference between the shape of a person and the fact of a person, and the fact of Darren was gone. What was left was a structure, an accurate, detailed, well-constructed structure that moved and spoke and responded to direct input, but did not generate anything on its own. It did not whistle, which Darren always did on steep climbs. It did not stop to look at a view, which Darren always did, often to my impatience. It did not adjust its cap, or shift its pack straps, or do any of the 100 small, unconscious things that Darren did constantly that I had never cataloged until they stopped. We made it back to the saddle by mid-afternoon and pushed on toward the second night's campsite. I was exhausted and scared in a way that I could not name, because the thing I was scared of did not have a shape yet. It was not a monster. It was not a threat. It was an absence wearing my friend's body, and I had no framework for being afraid of an absence. That night I could not sleep. Darren, or the thing in Darren, went to sleep instantly. He lay down in his sleeping bag in that same straight posture, legs together, arms at his sides, and closed his eyes, and his breathing became deep and regular within a minute. I lay 3 feet away and listened to him breathe and tried to find something wrong with the breathing. I could not. It was perfect. Exactly the right rate, exactly the right depth. And I realized that was the problem. Darren snored. Not loudly, not every night, but often enough that it was a running joke between us. This breathing was metronomic, mechanical. It sounded like a machine simulating sleep. I got up around 2 in the morning and walked a short distance from camp and sat on a rock and tried to think clearly. The stars were astonishing. The valley below us was black, and the sky above was thick with light, and I sat there shivering in the cold and tried to figure out what I was going to do. I considered the possibility that I was the one having a breakdown, that Darren was fine, that he was just tired and quiet, and that my own brain was projecting strangeness onto ordinary behavior. I considered this seriously. But then I thought about the eyes. That smooth mechanical tracking. That is not something anxiety invents. That is not something fatigue distorts. I saw it in full daylight, from 2 feet away, and it was real. I also thought about the creek. 20 minutes for 2 liters of water, the sound of the bottles being set down on the rocks, and then nothing I could identify for the rest of the time. No splashing, no pump noise, just the water and the wind. What happened in those 20 minutes? What was at that creek? I wanted to go back and look, and I also knew with absolute certainty that I would not go back to that valley for any reason ever. The weather had changed overnight. Clouds had moved in from the west, low and gray and heavy, and the wind was pushing hard enough to make the lodge poles creak. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees from the day before. Everything felt contracted, tight, like the landscape itself was closing in. Darren walked in front of me and did not speak unless I spoke to him. When I spoke to him, he answered in those short, flat, correct sentences. The right words, no soul behind them. About 3 miles from the trailhead, something happened that I have not told anyone about until now. We were descending through a section of dense forest. On the trail, narrow and hemmed in by trees on both sides, visibility maybe 20 yards. I was watching Darren's back, the way I had been doing all day, cataloging the wrongness, and he stopped. Just stopped, mid-stride, and stood perfectly still. I stopped behind him and waited. 5 seconds. 10. I asked him what was wrong. He did not turn around. He said in that flat voice, "Something is here." The fear I felt in that moment was unlike anything I have experienced before or since. Not because of what he said, but because of what the sentence implied. Whatever was operating Darren's body had detected something in these woods that concerned it, which meant that there were things in the world worse than what had already happened, and one of them was nearby. I said, "What do you mean?" He did not answer. He stood there for another few seconds, then started walking again as if nothing had happened. I followed. I had no choice. The trail was the only way out. For the next 3 miles, I walked with every nerve firing, scanning the trees on both sides, listening past the wind for movement, feeling watched from a direction I could not identify. I saw nothing. I heard nothing. But the air felt dense with attention, the way a room feels when someone is standing just behind you. We reached the truck at noon. I drove. Darren sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his thighs and looked straight ahead through the windshield. I drove fast, too fast for the forest road, the truck bouncing over ruts and potholes, because I wanted pavement under me and cell signal and other human beings within shouting distance. When we hit the highway, I pulled into the first gas station I saw and went inside and stood in the fluorescent light among the chips and sodas and felt a relief so profound it almost made me sick. I called Darren's sister from the gas station bathroom. I told her I thought Darren might be having some kind of medical episode, that he was not acting like himself, that he was not talking normally. She asked if he was conscious and oriented. I said yes. She asked if he knew where he was. I went back out and asked him. He said Montana. She said it sounded like it could be altitude sickness or exhaustion, and to get him to an urgent care if it did not improve. She did not sound worried. I did not know how to explain what I was seeing in a way that would make her worried, because every individual piece of it sounded minor. He is quiet. He is sitting differently. He did not snore. How do you convey that the sum of those things equals something catastrophic? I drove us to Bozeman. I brought Darren to an urgent care clinic near the airport. I sat in the waiting room for an hour while they examined him. The doctor came out and told me that Darren's vitals were normal, his neurological exam was normal, his blood oxygen was fine, his pupils were equal and reactive. He said Darren seemed a little flat in effect, but was fully oriented and coherent, and that it was most likely fatigue. He suggested rest and fluids and said to go to an ER if anything changed. Nothing he said was wrong. Everything he measured was accurate. But you cannot measure what is missing, when what is missing is a person's entire interior. We flew home the next day. Darren sat next to me on the plane and looked straight ahead, and when the flight attendant asked if he wanted a drink, he said water, and the word came out with no inflection at all, just a sound that meant a thing. I watched him drink the water. He held the cup with all 5 fingers spaced evenly around it, not the way you or I hold a cup, gripping it at the handle or wrapping 3 fingers around the side. 5 fingers, evenly spaced, the way you would hold a cup if you had calculated the most structurally stable grip from first principles. When we landed in Atlanta, Darren's sister picked him up. I watched him get into her car. He buckled his seatbelt and looked forward. She waved at me. I waved back. And that was the last time I saw Darren in person. That was 11 months ago. Darren is still alive, if that is the right word. He went back to work after a week. His crew says he does his job fine. He shows up, he builds walls and lays stone and operates equipment, and he does it with the precision that his foreman says is actually better than before. He does not make mistakes. He also does not talk to his crew beyond direct task instructions. He does not eat lunch with them. He does not laugh. His sister says he comes to family dinners and sits and eats and answers questions and goes home. She says he seems depressed and has tried to get him into therapy. He went once, and the therapist said he was cooperative but guarded and recommended follow-up sessions. He went to 3 more and then stopped. The therapist apparently found nothing clinically actionable. I have called him several times. He answers. He says hello. He responds to questions. But the conversation never has gravity. It never builds to anything. It is like talking to a very accurate transcript of a person rather than the person. I have tried bringing up shared memories, specific details, the ditch in Big Bend, the Buckhead client, the time we got lost in Pisgah and argued about which way was north for 2 hours. He confirms that these things happened. He provides correct details if I ask. But he does not volunteer anything, does not add anything, does not inhabit the memories the way someone does when they were actually there. I went back and looked at the map. The creek where we camped, the tributary in that east-west valley. It does not appear on every map. The USGS topo shows it. 2 other mapping apps show a contour depression in that area, but no water feature. I looked at satellite imagery, and the valley is there, but it is deeper and narrower than it looked from the inside, and the tree cover is so dense that I cannot see the creek at all. I contacted a ranger station in the district and asked about water quality reports for that drainage. The person I spoke to said they did not have data on that specific tributary and that it was in a section of the wilderness that does not see much traffic. When I asked if there had been any unusual reports from hikers in that area, she paused for a moment and said, "Not that I am aware of," and changed the subject. I do not know what happened at the creek. I do not know if something came out of the water, or if something was waiting near the water, or if the water itself did something that I do not have language for. I know that my friend walked 30 yards into the trees on the 3rd evening of our trip, and the person who walked back was not him. The body is his. The memories are accessible. The skills are intact. But the thing that made Darren, the warmth, the rhythm, the way he made you feel like you were the most important person in any room, the unconscious music of a living personality, all of that is gone. And something else is in there now, operating the controls with a competence that fools everyone who did not know him well enough to hear the difference. His sister called me last month and said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about. She said Darren has started going on hikes again, alone. Weekend trips, she said. He drives north and does not say where he is going and comes back Sunday night and puts his gear away and goes to bed. She asked if I thought that was a good sign, if maybe he was working through whatever happened to him up there. I said maybe. I did not say what I actually think, which is that whatever is wearing my friend is going back to the creek. I think it goes there regularly. I think it has business there that I cannot imagine and do not want to. And the thing that keeps me up at night, the thing that I cannot put down no matter how many reasonable explanations I pick up, is this. The night I sat on that rock at 2 a.m, shivering under the stars while the thing that used to be Darren slept 3 feet from our campsite, I heard something from the valley below, from the direction of the creek. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but I heard it. It was whistling. The same 5 or 6 notes, over and over, in the exact melody that Darren always whistled on steep climbs. The melody I had heard 100 times. The melody the thing in Darren's body never once produced. Something down there still has that part of him. The real part. The part that whistles without thinking about it. That grins with the gap in his teeth because something is genuinely funny. All that makes you feel known and welcome and seen. That part is at the creek. And whatever came back to camp with 2 full water bottles and sat down with its legs straight and its hands on its thighs and said yes, the water was cold, that thing left the real Darren behind and took everything else. I do not go to the mountains anymore. I do not go to creeks. I have not spoken to Darren since his sister called, because every time I hear that flat, tuneless voice on the phone, I have to hang up and sit in my car with the doors locked until my hands stop shaking. But I listen. Late at night, when my house is quiet and the windows are open, I listen for whistling. Because if whatever took Darren learned how to bring the rest of him back, if it figured out how to copy that last missing piece, then there would be no way to tell the difference anymore. And I think that might be worse than anything. Not the monster you can see, not the absence you can name, but the perfect copy, the finished product, walking around in the world with your best friend's face and your best friend's voice, and every single detail right, and no one left who remembers what was missing long enough to know it has been filled in wrong. Remember, some places don't want you to leave. Thanks for watching the video.